Well, hello and welcome to Work Cookie, our weekly gathering of IO's, HR's, recruiters, and an actor, as we try to make the world of work just a little bit better. And today, Emi, we're going to continue our discussion, and I believe today we're going to talk about the expectation dilemma, balancing organizational and employee needs. And especially right now, it seems like the organization and the employee needs are heading in opposite directions. So how do we stop that and move in the right direction?
Well, I wish I had an answer for that that's just direct and a one-liner, but I think that's what we need our experts here today for, to really talk about this conflict that we're seeing in the workplace. And so I'm going to talk through a few different resources that I put in the chat for those who are here. One of them is actually something that was at the SIOP conference, so I thought that would be a good place to start. It's their Global Human Capital Trends report that's out there. And so they did a discussion on that. And I think the one that I looked at was 2023 and 2024 as well. I may not have put 2024 in the chat, but their focus really is on purpose, well-being, and performance in the working world. And they provided some really key insights around integrating worker well-being, which was a topic at the conference as well, including Ian, who often is contributing to this particular podcast. And really that strategy for seeing improved outcomes in engagement and performance. But we're actually seeing lots of conflict. And I asked this question directly in that session. We're seeing a lot of conflict with the reality of what's happening in workplaces and people investing time, energy into engagement or training or providing the resources that employees need to be successful. And I think sometimes we'll see this shift when we go to like employer-friendly market, employee-friendly market, right? And one of the previous podcasts, we talked about this concept of quiet quitting, which tends to happen more in your employee-friendly markets, right? Where people have the opportunity to get 2, 3 offers on the table, make the selection, and maybe even quiet quit. I've had people quiet quit on our teams before in the past, where the next day they just don't show up, or they don't answer or respond, or they'll send, "Hey, my last day is today," email and drop off their stuff. Things like that are happening still, even in an employer-friendly market, and I'm still seeing that, in my workplace, particularly as well. And so I've heard this stories around this, and so where is the gap, right, between what we're seeing in research and what we're actually seeing happening from leaders and organizations in keeping people engaged? One of the other resources I had was the relationship between employee voice and organizational performance, which really draws the line between open communication, inclusion in decision making, and providing enhancements to engagement and productivity when we're providing that space for employee voice. Which I think, again, you'll see sometimes happening really strong when there'll be a lot of push for that in the value systems. But then when there's changes or turmoil or things happening, often then there's the financial focus only in organizations, which is kind of a short-term strategy. And mind you, some organizations, you're about to go bankrupt, right? The short-term financial strategy is important. I do want to acknowledge that, because businesses are not just here to provide a warm and fuzzy place for us to lay. We're there to work, right? We're there to produce and create and innovate in some cases. And there is a balance here. But what I'm seeing personally is the growing chasm here between these two. What does the employee need, want to perform, to be able to be productive, to stay engaged, which we know has tremendous outcomes as far as what they're delivering and the end product even, and the value of the product or the quality of the product, right? And then the engagement and what it takes to get that done. And, we've talked a little bit here too about generational differences, the push for the work-life balance. And there was a meta-analysis done in 2024 that I also referenced there, synthesizing some data showing productivity, innovation, and retention are really the outcomes to the engagement, right? So if we're wanting productivity, innovation, retention, there are costs associated with those. Why are we not seeing a stronger push for all of the things that research is showing us will create employees who are productive, innovative, and retained? So I throw that out there for discussion, because I don't have the perfect answer, right? I know it lies within leaders, and leaders taking the onus to understand that there is a gap here, and what can we start doing to bridge it?
Let me ask you this, because I want to focus a little bit on human capital and the whole notion of the value of an employee. And, right now, if I've got a business and I'm paying somebody $100,000 a year, that's their value. It's $100,000 a year. But I talked to an economist a couple of years ago, and they're actually trying to change the balance sheet. And so I could have that $100,000 employee, but that employee is generating $1 million for my company every single year. So what they're saying is the value of that employee is not the $100,000, it's the $1 million. And if you actually change your budget sheet, the way you're doing your accounting, it actually gives a better representation of where the organization is. So is there any chance that someday soon in my dreamland that will actually give employees their true value?
I'm hopeful, and I love that an economist is also a part of that conversation and how we quantify these things. It also can be cost savings, not even cost generating, right? Maybe you have someone who is really good at digging through the weeds and clipping the corners that are within the value systems and with integrity, able to be trimmed, right? Able to integrate technology to solve problems, maybe with, that creates value, right? There are lots of ways to quantify what that value is. And it's not based on what I pay people. And it's certainly even not based on hours. I've mentioned this before. I mean, robots win the hours race every time, right? And so we think about outcomes and calculating the value of outcomes. I think that's more the mindset shift that needs to start happening. And with that technology integration, I mean, that human-centric leadership is the area I really love. And that to me is a human-centric practice, right? Like really understanding the true value outside of what do I pay you, which is kind of minute if there are other factors financially in your organization that are being really lit on fire by an individual and what they're doing or what they're not doing for that matter, right?
Well, let me ask you this, because you brought up the notion of changing your mindset, and we've gone through an economic roller coaster in the last 5 years, and I think we've all seen it. When they need employees, they treat them incredibly well. When there's a lot of employees looking for work, they seem to forget that. So how do we actually talk to the C-suite and go, there is a better way. You've got two options. There's a better way. You keep choosing the wrong one. Maybe it's time for a change, because, what's the definition of insanity? Just doing the same thing over and over again.
Right. There seems to be that malleability of values, right? Where when I can get something out of my employees, this is the value system, and I no longer need to get that out of them. Maybe I shift my value system a little bit, or my focus, right? And I think there's also one more resource I added there. It's a job demands resources theory that was listed in there. And it really talks about balancing those productivity expectations with the areas of flexibility, autonomy, and the things that the employees want. But like we said, it is a mindset shift. And I think it needs to be transformational. I mean, this is not going to happen overnight, right? This is a transformation. But as we think about integrating AI as team members, robots as team members, other technologies as team members, these are the things that I think really start preceding the need for the conversation about how do we make large mindset shifts. We've seen it happen in other different kinds of changes that we've had in our working world, whether it's technology related, finances, economy, right? Those things shift the way we do work. It shifts businesses. I was talking to my husband last night about the concept of restaurants. I used to work for Cisco Foods. And one of the things that they talked about that really exploded them was World War II and the need for food options for families to be able to pick up something quick that they didn't do at home. That sort of entire community shift, those things happen, right? And so we've seen it happen before. People are a bit scared with the technology integration element of that, but we can reflect on history, on how we've mindset shifted before, and I think adopt some of those things that worked from those previous changes.
Well, in times like this, where the economy is so crazy, it's time for a shift. Like, this might be the ideal opportunity. And also, you mentioned, what we did in the past. And I recently heard a psychologist talking about We had a generation that went through the Second World War together, and it was people of every economic range. And what they really saw was how the world can destroy itself. And they saw all that cruelty, all that destruction, and they came back from the war going, we need to move together as one. We need to be a united society. We need to look after each other. Really seems as that generation has left our government, that the generation that's come up is much more me, myself, and I. Is that part of the mind shift that, not just a mind shift in our economy, but a mind shift in society?
It is, but we also have to remember that there are certain communities, areas around the world that do have still retained that collectivist for the common good mentality and culture. I think there's a lot of reflection that needs to be done. I realize we're a very individualistic culture on the Western side, right? But looking out for yourself doesn't have to be devoid of looking out for others. I think that's also that human-centric leadership piece. You can look out for yourself. I have had a struggle as a mom to see myself as an important person at the table, right on the opposite end of that. And so I've had to acknowledge myself as a person that's sitting at the table. It's really the opposite side of that, right? You're not only the head, you're a part of a circular table, right? In your teams and in your organizations. Everybody there is a human, everybody matters, their contribution matters. Even those who clean the toilets, right? Like, I don't want to go to my office and have a nasty toilet. And so, that's a really kind of gross extreme example, right? But it is speaking to the value of every single person, every job, every task that makes that community run, whether the community is an organization or society, maybe a nonprofit, right? This is true of every single community.
Well, it sounds like the IO psychology community is going to be very busy over the next generation, maybe two. I've talked enough. Lee, let's go to you.
In many ways, we're a victim of our own success, because as you go through the generations, and each generation has it a little bit easier than the generation before. And as the struggle lessens, as the lives ease or whatever else, a lot of those things that we're talking about just kind of fade to the background. So they're not a focus because, the poor in this country are doing better than the majority in a lot of other countries. Yeah. You got people out there who we consider poor who have iPhones. And you got people in other countries who don't have clean water. So, it's completely skewed when you look at it. So that's part of our issue, is that our affluence is kind of an Achilles heel in some ways, because we don't look at these things. Another issue is, as we've talked about before, the huge gap between research and application. When they complete the research and they get some fantastic information, and then it takes 14, 15 years for it to trickle down into the marketplace. And you can kind of say that's on us being science practitioners, except that somebody's got to listen to us. And so getting more of that knowledge into the workplace to shorten that gap will help a lot. But that's also a challenge too, because when you walk into a potential employer or a client or whatever, they don't want to hear about the science. They don't want to hear about this great study that you get. They're just hearing is all they hear. You've got to go in and you've got to give solutions. And if they ask later, hey, that's cool, where'd you get that? Well, in this great study back in, but you don't lead with that. But so many people do, because you come out of school with all this great knowledge and all this, all these research things and blah, blah, and this is where science, blah, and you go in there and they don't care. They really don't. And so you have to change your approach to go in there. And another side of that is, we talked before, leadership training for management. A lot of people, just because they're in charge doesn't mean they know how to be in charge. And so they're not focusing on the people, they're focusing on, bottom line or whatever else, and not realizing that the people are what makes all that possible. And when you don't have any kind of background in social sciences or whatever else, and you don't understand that thing, and you talked about value. Well, the reality is what you pay an employee is not value, it's cost. When you talk about your budget, what I'm paying an employee is a cost to me. Now, are they worth it? Let's hope so. The value they bring is how much productivity, how many sales, all the things, the actual things over and above, because the actual value is what they bring into the organization over and above what we pay them. That's where the value is, because before that, it's just cost. If they're not bringing something beyond what we're paying them, then they're drained. We're not getting a return on our investment there. I mean, and switching to that humor, more human worker centric is very important. I mean, like my organization, used to be, we do contracts, and used to be when a contract ended, so did your employment if there wasn't another contract. And then at some point, somebody really smart realized that's costing us a lot of money because turnover is expensive. So we get rid of all these, experienced, knowledgeable people, and then we have to hire new people or even hire them back. And we have to go through all the onboarding and all the costs associated with that. And if I get a contract today and I don't have anybody to put on it, well, they're not paying me while I'm not providing services. So if I don't have consultants to put on a contract, they're not going to pay me until I do. And so if a contract starts today, but I can't get somebody on site for 2 weeks, that's 2 weeks. They're not going to pay me because I'm not providing them any value. And so when you have those people, okay, maybe we float them for a month. It's still less expensive than, replacement, turnover costs and lost revenue on a contract that you can't start on time or you can't fully man on time. So once you figure out that you need this resource, because people are a resource, and they're just as they're just as, if not more important than any widget or screw or printer paper or whatever else, because that's the engine that drives it. It's like trying to get in your car and realizing there's no engine there. You're not going to get very far. And that's what we need to get to the people, is properly bringing in the right people, making sure that they're trained, giving them the opportunity to move in their career, paying them what they're worth for what they bring to our organization is all very important. And yeah, okay, so we all want people, how about the lowest, I'm going to pay for the lowest thing. Well, you get what you pay for. Buyer beware, and if you're consistently trying to lowball and whatever else, the people that you bring into your organization are going to reflect that. Not that they're not necessarily quality people, but it means they may not be really qualified for what you need. And so you're going to get less from that. So there's a whole paradigm shift that's required there. And we need people who understand people that are going to work with that, to be able to bring in the training, to bring in the stuff. But you got to get people that are actually going to pay attention to you. And that's our challenge.
That's always the struggle. And I think you're right, because I think we're in a situation now where, quite frankly, business owners are going to make a lot of mistakes. If I've got a factory, I've got 100 employees, all of a sudden I've lost half my market. The only thing I'm thinking about is I'm going to have to cut half my employees. But there's other ways of dealing with that, is there not?
There's always options. Unfortunately, the great shift in the 80s, we got into this mindset that layoffs were a budget balancing tool, and without taking into account the human cost of that. And there are a lot of companies out there that actually, as a strategy, will lay off a bunch of people to reset their salary baselines. So I may hire the exact same positions back, but I'm going to pay somebody less to do it. Or at least that's the goal. Then we know when you replace somebody, most of the time you end up hiring somebody making more than the person you replaced. So that kind of tends to bite you, where the sun don't shine. But people have to understand that. And a lot of times this is where you do have to bring in the number crunchers with you so that you can really show the cost, the actual return on investment, the actual cost, so you can say, look, this is the bottom line. This is what these actions are tangibly costing you. Sales, market share, turnover costs, and of course it comes back to what Jeremy likes to say, what if we train people and they leave? Well, what if we don't train them and they stay? That's we discount training costs, but training costs is an investment. It's not just a cost.
I think we need to find a couple where one person is a world-class economist and their partner is an IO psychologist. Maybe then blend them, we might have something. Thanks very much, Lee. Nick, let's go to you.
Yeah, I think there's a whole lot to unpack here. We oftentimes in these conversations focus so much on the employee side, the individual side, the humanistic side. And there is a ton of expectation that they should be at work, be productive, be contributing. We make allowances that they're human and they have things coming in from the outside. But I think from the organizational side, in the last 50 or so years, the expectations of what an organization provides have changed so rapidly. It used to be you started in the mailroom, you got the CEO, you got, a pension and a gold watch. And now, both sides, you have layoffs happening rapidly, you have job hopping because people are trying to leverage one side against the others. And I think a majority of businesses, big, small, or otherwise, are not sitting there twisting their mustaches going, how can we keep the little man down? They are more likely focused on how are we going to keep the doors open. And I know my experience with small business owners, they feel the most stress when things take a downturn because they feel the weight and they see the day-to-day of I'm in charge of these people's budgets. I support their livelihood. There's only so much emotional baggage that they can take on the sake of their staff. But I think there are a lot of good leaders, managers, business owners out there. Problem is when you get to scale and we start thinking that 1,000-foot view and we're thinking about, the big companies who, there's no possible way they could go out of business. Well, then, yeah, you get disconnected from that human level a whole lot. And I think individuals, good, bad, or otherwise, come to think that I need to come to work and work with a purpose. And that's great. And it drives engagement. But, are there other places to find those purposes? Volunteering, community groups, and all of that. And so some of those other social structures that are not as strong as they were 50 years ago, now people are putting that onto their organization to take care of those needs for them. And so you kind of get this, well, can you have it both ways? I'm just here for a paycheck, but I want them to take care of me. And so I think somebody mentioned kind of a social contract sort of idea. Like, what are you getting yourself into as far as I work for this organization and now that's part of my identity, or these guys sign my paycheck so I can, feed my family and go be in my community and do what I need to do there.
Let me ask you this, Nick, because you're absolutely right. Where small businesses are the backbone of the economy, and there's many more small businesses than the large corporations. They might not hire as much people, but I think most businesses are under sort of the illusion that in times like this where the economy is tough, well, IO psychology, that's something for the big businesses. It's not for me and my wife who own this restaurant. Especially in times like this, isn't it important that they actually really do engage an IO psychologist to help them navigate this so that those small businesses can not only survive through economic times like this, but will be in the right place to grow once things improve?
I mean, yes, the answer is always hire an IO psychologist, because the situations differ from business to business. I think, like I said, those smaller organizations are close to that individual level. And so when things get tight or critical, they try to cut to the quick and get to the, how do I keep the lights on today? And so they may not have the mental bandwidth to engage, and say, oh, well, how do we, weather this adversity so we come back stronger? I mean, we look at all sort of the classic business examples. I finished a book that was kind of a same idea as like Good to Great, where they looked at, these businesses are successful and how do we emulate that? And even those case studies in large portion, I think some of them have gone out of business. So times do change and they do react, and what worked yesterday may not work tomorrow. But I think if you can find a way to even just once a week take a zoom out and go, okay, this is what we got through, this is what we're up against. And it gets harder and harder the more uncertain things are. And the news cycle changes every 6 to 12 hours, depending on decisions that are being made up top. And it is scary. And the fear response and the way our brains are wired, we're gonna get in the cave. We're gonna put a stone across it so nobody can hurt us. And I think that's the same with business. We're gonna get to what we do well. We're gonna do 2 or 3 things really, really well. And a lot of times that does bring people back to their core business, so they can build out from that when the sun shines again. But yeah, I think trying to take that long-term view, which is not not what we're wired to do, but being able to pause and say, this too shall pass. It's not the fad of the day. It's not the news cycle. It's okay. Yes, we want to keep the lights on tomorrow, but I also want to keep the lights on for 5-6 years to come.
Thank you very much for that. And, Dr. Emi, I'm starting to think maybe we should do a month on how to run your business during times of fear and anxiety.
That sounds like a perfect topic. And very timely, right? So I did want to touch on a couple of things. I'm going to challenge something that Lee said a little bit on this new generation, the next generation kind of having it better. I think that is entirely dependent on the decisions that the generation makes, right? So if we're not making good decisions today, our next generation is going to reap the sorry benefits of it, right? And so I know that we kind of have experienced that, particularly in Western culture in a lot of different areas, but it is entirely dependent on the decisions that generation who's enjoying things or making it better for the next generation makes, right? And sometimes good intentions will pave the road to hell, for lack of a better word, right? And so even well-intentioned decisions that we're making here in this generation can have an adverse impact in the next one, which I think really speaks to the importance of being intentional in that space, because we can be destroying things for the economy, for Social Security, whatever those things are, right? Like we can, in our decisions today, destroy what that looks like for our children or our grandchildren even, right? It may not be an impact we see immediately, but it can be multi-generational. And so I do really challenge leaders to really think about that, because your decisions are paving a road or destroying it potentially, right? And you can really think about it in both aspects there. And I want to touch on another word that was mentioned there, resource, right? And I pulled up what the Oxford definition of a resource is, because I was like, well, let's see what resource actually is defined as. And so it says a stock or supply of money, material, staff, or other assets that can be drawn on by a person or organization in order to function, keyword, effectively, right? And so when we think about being ineffective as an organization, having outcomes in your system that you don't want, there is sometimes then going to be that need to look at the resources. But the verb definition of it says providing a person or organization with materials, money, staff, or other assets necessary for that effective operation. So the resource needs resources, right? Your resource needs resources to be effective. So the human is a resource to the organization, but the organization should also, in turn, be providing resources for that relationship to run actually very smoothly or effectively. And I think that's where I'm seeing some of those disconnects, right? The organization often sees the human as the resource or the thing that's going to help them get to their goal, but does not understand that they are also a provider of resources for the resource, right? I think I'm seeing some gap in that sense there. So I think that's an interesting word that we can kind of flip a little bit there to see, I think, the duality there. A friend of mine was just having a conversation with me last night, and she'll never listen to this, but I'm still going to try to be as anonymous as possible. And she was telling, she's works as a tax professional, a tax leader. And as her company has had some financial issues recently, they have asked her to do some maybe not so ethical, potentially even illegal, maybe things as you're thinking about taxes, right? Because that does have legal ramifications. And she's very cut and dry when it comes to taxes. She's like, nope, I'm a CPA and it's yes or no, or this or that. And I may do some interpretation, but I will always keep myself and my conscience clear when I'm making those decisions around tax. And she's actually gotten some pushback and even been pegged, I think, as not a team player because she's not going above and beyond, which, hello, there's legal ramifications in her sphere. And so she is in this conflict here of I'm not being provided the environment even that is necessary for me to do my job most effectively, which is within the confines of the tax law. And I have to abide by this. And I mean, there are plenty of people we see court cases all the time, right? Where we see that not everybody follows the tax laws to a T, but in her particular case, it's very important for her in her job. She doesn't want to, impact future jobs by having this stain on her career of having done some unethical things. And so it's a very interesting situation for her. And I do empathize with her a lot because she does want to be a team player, but she's not being provided the environmental resource in that sense, and or culture, right? We've talked a lot about culture, right? But we've talked only a little bit about it in this month. So I do want to throw that word out there because I've worked for cultures that are only the culture when they when they can get something out of the employee, right? I think it was a couple of folks, a little Popcorn Friday video thing I saw on LinkedIn today. It was really funny because it was the CEO just pumping himself up that he provided popcorn to the employees on Friday. And he was giving excitement that the next Friday they were going to get, drum roll, pizza. And so it was just this like cheeky way to say like, hey, these like little things don't actually matter this much to your people. And this isn't building your culture in that sense. And if your values are not enduring beyond the current circumstances, your circumstances change and your values then change, then is it really a value or is it a strategy you're using, right? And how are you communicating that? Because I think that's an expectation dilemma, right, if you will, that you'll see in organizations. I thought they really cared about people, but they just laid off half of the workforce because of the economic downturn. And now they've cut out all of the fun stuff. And now they're just asking us to adopt the work of the other half of the organization and fold it into our job and work late hours. That is a value system that didn't endure beyond a circumstance, situation, or challenge, right? And so that to me, I think speaks to the resourcing of the resource.
The more you were talking, the more I was feeling bad because we do need to change the mindset and we've got to, think differently. But this mindset was created by old white guys like me. And I kind of had a thought a few days ago, maybe it's time for us to get out of the way. Maybe it's time for the old white guys like me to, who is next in line? Who's going to be taking over next for me? And maybe there's some new and exciting ideas that my old brain, the gray hair and the gray matter are starting to blend. Maybe it's time for us to at least look to those younger generations and start to bring them up because they can be the change agents.
Oh, so I half agree with you. Tom, I think your perspective provides immense value too, right? Both perspectives do. And I think there needs to be a bridge. And I think what needs to happen is meeting in the middle of the bridge, right? Not that one is better than the other, but I think what an older generation can offer is wisdom and some discernment that younger ones cannot, and experience that they have not yet had, right? And although the world is changing and will continue to do so, there is so much to say about the value of experience. And I think we're not speaking that loud enough. And I very much love mentors for that reason. I draw on them. Every little thing that they'll teach me, I will absorb like a sponge. And, I think whether the mentor is male or female, whatever race or ethnicity or background they are, right, it doesn't really matter. I think everybody's got that value.
Until we push you off the bridge. Anyways, Amanda Ray, good to see you. Let's go to you.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you're at, or evening if you're listening in later. So there was a few items that Nick ended up mentioning that brought me into some experiences I have had with some leaders where there was some very eye-opening moments where how often are leaders unaware of what the actual needs of their workforce are? And the larger and more diversified you get, the more diversified the needs get. So there's the need from a much higher level to, one, recognize what groups make up your workforce, and have you done your due diligence in actually assessing what their needs are? There are a lot of areas where there is employees that all they want is a paycheck, because individual employees have different needs. So for instance, my lovely husband, he's not looking for a role where he's finding a purpose. He finds his purpose at home with his family and with, like Nick was indicating, outside activities, because that's what fulfills him. Myself, on the other hand, I spent a lot of time, effort, energy, resources, money to being able to find and engage in my purpose. And it's different for each and every individual employee. And that requires a certain skill set from an organization of being able to be agile to meet those organizational needs. And being able to do that takes time, effort, and energy from the leaders in order to invest in that, in order to mitigate just that transactional. Because at the end of the day, we are essentially getting paid for our productivity and our time that we're there for. That is at the bare minimum. But when you go beyond and starting to meet the employees and the workforce's needs by filling their heart, filling their head with other items, that's when they start to give more of themselves and they go above and beyond, and you'll see higher engagement. And I think that's where, like you were saying, the small business is really kind of the backbone of this country, because the small businesses have a very close touch with what their workforce needs, because their workforce is small. They're able to see and they're able to be more agile to what their workforce's needs are. So that's been some interesting conversations that just I've had in various areas, even just in peer-to-peer conversations in like ICF. The other thing that comes to mind is that if there is an employee that is looking for that purpose, are you aware of what your values are? And if you are, you need to then find an organization that is aligned with your values, because the likelihood that you will then be able to fulfill your purpose further increases, because then you're looking for organizations that, for, let's say, you highly value family and they are a family-oriented agency or family-oriented organization, business, etc. That gives you the opportunity to then have your other needs outside of a paycheck met, because then your values are aligned. So that's something I've often encouraged when I've done career coaching, that if you're looking to make that shift and you need to have other things met beyond a paycheck, what are your values? And look for organizations that are in as close of alignment as possible, and get in the recruiter's ear. Find out who's in-house, do information interviews, get known, because then when those opportunities do come up, you have your foot in the door already. You're just waiting for that door to open further.
Let me ask you, if you don't mind, how do you keep that authentic? Because I could take that philosophy of what you've just said, and I could go back to the old Roman bread and circuses. As long as I keep them, from starving and keep them entertained, they'll be easy to control. So how do I not go down that path?
That comes to what Dr. Emi was referencing, are your values, or is it a strategy? Because in the long run, sticking to your values identifies your integrity as an organization and as an individual. So if you're finding that your values shift based upon strategy, that's great, but you need to own that and indicate that this may not be a place for individuals that are looking for a purpose, because transparency, honesty within an organizational capacity can really help garnish, because when we're thinking about like the economic and job environment in which we're in, there is a lot of uncertainty, like we were talking about, and that uncertainty creates fear, essentially. And fear, am I safe in my job, which has direct repercussions to, will I be able to feed my family? Will I be able to keep my child's clothes? Will I be able to keep a house over my family's head? So there's real ramifications from that. But if you're able to be honest, as transparent as you can be, because I understand that within especially different organizations that transparency varies, especially as things are getting known and unknown. But yeah, I often go back to be as transparent as possible. And that kind of leads to kind of another thought I had is that I know we've talked a lot about the humanity component, especially at the employee level. There is a humanity component that is seen within middle management that is often stuck between the two of those that are being told, this is what I want to see, and the lower level being trying to also get their needs met. That if they are told to deliver a message that is not in alignment with their own value structure and that they know is going to have a harmful impact on those that report to them, and I've seen this quite a bit in nonprofits because and in private in speaking with colleagues and peers and just friends in general, but that translation of finding how to articulate a decision that's been made that is not in alignment with your own values, middle management struggles with that on a frequently more common basis than I believe that is acknowledged. I don't think that there's a lot of research on it, unfortunately, but it is an area where that cognitive dissonance really starts to come up because these individuals know those people that report to them, but they also know who they report to and they can see how everything's interconnected, but they also have to live in their own value system. And that's hard to bring home at the end of the day, is if you had to make a decision that is not in direct alignment with whatever your own personal value system may be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Thank you very much for that. Nic, let's go to you.
Yeah, back to kind of what Lee was saying about the generational shifts. I mean, there are these small things that can create big impacts. You think about, not to generate controversy, but No Child Left Behind and the impact that had on education. And now we're seeing people my age who had that experience, and that shifted education dramatically. The computer lab and the technology, we're seeing those people who have grown up with a smartphone in their hand, they're coming into the workforce, and there may be a mismatch. And to your point about, should, guys like you and me get out of the way? No, but I think that we need to pull up additional chairs to the table to expand those views and tell those stories and have more collaboration so that the solutions that are generated in that apply to more people. Because we always go back to, it depends. There's so many situational aspects, and there are times when, we're going to try this again, even though we know it has a high risk of failure because we've got a different set of circumstances that are in play. But I think those sociological shifts and the slow burn of some of those decisions and policies and whatever happens, yes, to Lee's point, yes, so far we've seen an increase in abundance and all of that. And I think there are so many people who don't have to think about like scarcity mindset. They don't necessarily have that competition of, I've got to fight for every inch. But at the same point, like there's still a lot of that built into business culture altogether. It's win at all costs. If you're not cheating, you're not trying. Sort of these sort of platitudes that we see all the time. And so it's going to take not only effort, but I think success with new methods to see those things start to shift. And that could happen tomorrow or 20 years from now, depending on what the business case is and the level of success that people see. And it's not easy. You have to be adaptable to individual situations, and everybody's looking for the one size fits all. What's the most utilitarian? What helps my bottom line and helps the most people, and all of that. So you can't fault organizations for being pragmatic, but I think at some point the pragmatism is going to be saying, "Hey, we have enough. Our profits are massive, and if everybody's food, water, shelter, then maybe we can send some of this down the chain so there's not that great disparity between the frontline employee and the CEO."
I would love to see that. Thank you very much for that, Nic. Dr. Emi, as we talk about the expectation dilemma, I'm starting to wonder if, as we're going through the times as we are, I'm a communication guy. I'm like, if you're a CEO, if you lead an organization, if you're middle management, you got to be talking to people. You've got to come forward with a plan for the organization. It's got to include everybody. So, but that's not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing, a lot of people being really quiet, the people in middle management and lower are just waiting for the hammer to fall. And the people in the C-suite are looking out for the hammers because they don't want to see them either. So what role can communication play in managing these expectations, especially in times like this?
Well, I think it's critical, obviously. We talk about communication all the time, but I want to touch on something Dr. Amanda Ray said, which is around transparency in communication, because saying I don't know is transparency too, right? If you don't know, and that's an okay response in a circumstance in which there is uncertainty or a lack of clarity. And I think sometimes leaders struggle with transparency if they don't have the exact message or all the information, or they have a fear of rejection themselves, or a fear of the response from the resource that they're going to be sharing this information with, right? I love the call out of transparency. In fact, I wrote it down here. And agility was there, but I mean, that's agility with transparency too, right? I am an over communicator. I'm a fan of that. My team knows they're probably going to get an email and a Teams message, and they may even get personally communicated with if I see no response and I've requested one, right? And so I want to make sure that information is permeating. There's actually a model out there called the honeycomb leadership model. I think it's honeycombleadership.com. And it talks about a multi-level process of permeating the organization. Transparency is an element of that, but it begins in their model with the individual focus, self-awareness, creating those competencies in your leadership skills first. And then your next level is enhancing your team collaboration and communication as well, and helping that leverage their individual strengths, but creating also an environment of teaming. And then that next level is then impacting the organization and the culture, the leadership culture, and the continuous learning of the entire organization. And the whole purpose is for flourishing of everyone within the organization. But communication is woven all throughout that honeycomb model, and how you achieve the human flourishing that the outcome is suggested there. And agility was mentioned also by Dr. Amanda Ray there. And I love that call out as well, because really it speaks to flexibility, situational, leadership in that sense, and being able to read the room and help respond effectively, which I think is where a lot of that experience comes in, and being able to lean on others and learning that, because you can learn when to communicate, how, what type of communication does this require? Like, those are things that are learned. Those are not things that we're born knowing. It's not something because you got a title, you're going to know magically, and this, got sent into your brain and all of a sudden you're a manager, right? And so these are things that have to be extremely intentional, both from the organizational perspective, but I love the call out of the employee's responsibility also, right? Like, just as a worker, we also have a responsibility to uphold our integrity and our value systems, to know that about the organization, to ask those questions, and then to make decisions. Because in some cases, the decision is, I know that this company is not the forever spot and my values are not exactly aligned, but I need a paycheck right now. My family is hungry, right? And so just making those intentional decisions, I think, is important. And something I think that I heard at PSYOP that was used in a negative connotation, which I challenge a bit, was the word bold and being bold. I actually love boldness, and I think that it's more needed. People that do stand firm in their values, people that do stand firm in what they believe is right and wrong, and make decisions based on that moral compass that they have in their workplaces too, right? I think I love a good BHAG, but it's always got to be for a reason. It's got to have intention, and I love to lead boldly. And boldly doesn't mean I'm aggressive. Bold doesn't mean that I'm abrasive with people. It doesn't mean that I steamroll by any sense of the word. In fact, I would consider myself a servant leader above anything else. But I am a bold servant leader. If my team needs something, I'm going to go and get it for them boldly. And I really do challenge leaders to think about that concept of boldness through their communication, through how they interact with others, really being bold about the values and the integrity, because I think that can really then provide that experience from the other end for the employees or for anyone in the organization to, feel some level of comfort. Communication isn't always going to be happy, everything's great, right? It's not that. And I certainly have gotten plenty of communication from my boss about, well, this might be coming down the pike, but I just wanted to give you a heads up, and that I appreciate.
Let me ask you this, because It's been fascinating up here watching the federal election and the debates and all the leaders. And you're seeing people who are proposing different leadership styles. And, we had the French language debate was last night. The English debate is tonight. And they're questioned about economic and social issues. But then when they start talking to people who have watched the debate, it's all about leadership. So, once again, there's different types of leadership. So, in your mind, what's the leadership style for today that we need to move forward with? And maybe it's not one size fits all, but maybe you can, get some people out of the I lead by a big stick.
Sure. So I like you said, there's no one size fits all. I think human-centric leadership is an emerging area that really speaks to the individualized nature of leaders and individuals. But situational leadership is then also a concept that I think needs to be looked into a little more, maybe some additional research even in our modern times, because if you're able to shift based on change with the situation and meet the needs of that situation and not just lead one way across all circumstances, to me, that's the better style in this time.
Well, I'm today going to start the Jeremy Lukaba 2028 candidacy.
I'm all for it.
Well, you're going to be the vice president. So there you go. Lee, let's go to you.
There are two things that I absolutely abhor in the workplace. And, one is mushroom management, keeping everybody in the dark and picking BS. And the other is black box working, where people just get in their little box and they do their thing and there's no peeking in. You don't know what they're doing. And both of those tend to be a symptom of fear, really. Yeah. Because a lot of times when you keep people in the dark, it's because you're afraid of them seeing the light. I mean, and I would challenge, well, if you're afraid of them finding out, are you really doing what you should be doing? Because, if you're breaking the law or something, I mean, yeah, wouldn't want anybody to know that. I mean, come on. But the reality is that, when things get shaky, people get nervous. When people get nervous, they do things that aren't necessarily even in their own best interest. And one way to get around that is to talk to them and to tell them, even if it's like Emi said, even if it's, I don't know, at least acknowledge. I mean, I tell my team, I will tell them everything unless I am expressly told that I can't. And my leadership knows that if they don't want me to tell my team, they better expressly tell me I can't, because otherwise I'm going to. Because if I keep them informed, they can make informed decisions, and it brings down their anxiety, and it lets them know that I am taking care of them and have their best interests, in mind. Because, when they start getting nervous, next thing you know, people are finding other jobs. People are not focusing on what they're doing. They're making mistakes. There is just not good. But when you can come in, I mean, even when things are shaky, even when things are having problems, even when there's a possibility of other stuff, if you come in and you tell them, hey, look, people, this is what's going on, and even taking that a step further, if you can elicit feedback and say, hey, look, this is what's going on. These are some possible ways we may have to go. These are not necessarily positive things. We are open to suggestions to avoid having to do a layoff, or, cutting salaries, or, whatever that sometimes these situations require. And if you are open to listening, I mean, you'd be surprised what the guy, in the trenches has noticed. I mean, he's down there where the stuff's happening. And hey, if you take this and you replace it with that, it's going to save you, $100,000 a quarter. Well, that's kind of good information to have. Let's look at that. And some of the best ideas. I mean, I kind of go with the Dale Carnegie thing, not knowing anything about steel, but hiring people who did. You know, I got a lot of really smart people that work for me that know stuff I don't know and I never will. And that's okay because I know who to call and they give me their ideas and I give them credit and it works. So talk to your people.
Everything I needed to know about life, I learned from Dale Carnegie. Let me ask you this, though, Lee, because I caught an interesting conversation a couple of days ago, and there was a bit of a panel, and they were talking about the economy in difficult times and what some organizations need to do, and they got onto the topic of, we may go through 6 months where we have to ask our employees to job share. So, you might not be working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. You might be working 2.5 days. And then the other half of the team is going to come in and work the other 2.5 days. And for a lot of people, it really seemed to make sense. And they were all very much, we got to support each other. But there are those voices that come through with, no way. I want my full job. I want my full salary. You keep me and you get rid of the other guy. I don't really care if the other person's suffering. So, how do we bring those two sides together? Is there a way to bring those two sides together?
I'm going to give the classic IO answer. It depends. Because it really depends on the people who are on those two sides and how reasonable they are. There have been many organizations who have gone through those lean times and they went, hey guys, look, here's the deal. We don't want to get rid of any of you people, but here is the economic reality that we're going to have to, reduce your pay for a period of time or whatever in order to not lay anybody off. The other option is a lot of you guys are going away. And sometimes you get a little crowdsourcing there. Sometimes, you're going to have to go one way or the other because you're going to get a revolt otherwise. And if the loudest voices are, we want full salary or nothing, well, you might consider putting them on that short list when that comes up. But, because you don't want to revolt. You don't want to say, hey, look, we're going to have to, because if you're going to have to go and reduce salaries for a period of time or what have you, and people are going to quit, well, then you've just defeated the purpose. I mean, the only thing you did was you didn't have to go through the hard conversation of laying somebody off. And come on, people. One of my old mentors, he always put it as, can you shoot your own dog? And it's from Old Yella. Where at the end, I'll take care of that for you. No, it's my responsibility. I'll do it. Even though it's terrible, it's unpleasant, it's horrifying, I will do it because it's my responsibility. And as a leader, that's what you need to be able to do. And if you're going to just hide behind, well, if I just do this, maybe they'll just quit. Maybe you're in the wrong place.
There you go. Thank you very much for that, Lee. Dr. Emi, we're almost out of time, but as this hour has gone by, there's a ton of business owners out there, all the way from the mom and pops to the corporate entities who, man, they need to reach out and talk to an IO psychologist right now. How do they do that?
Well, I think it's obviously there's, all of us out here who have our information out there on LinkedIn, but I think looking within their organizations, within their HR departments, oftentimes that'll be your first link, right? If you're unaware of where to start, people within your organization and asking around. I know that they sometimes will get embedded within like organizational change or transformation or change management. And so some of those areas are people maybe you can tap into within your organization if you don't have a contact already to go and reach out to and ask, who are some people you've seen in this area? Who are some people you've seen in this field? Maybe you have someone who you have a specific need, right? Whether it's coaching or leadership agility or training and development, right? And IO has so many different areas of specialty that kind of just picking one out of a hat is probably not the best strategy. But I would say linking up with someone who has a contact, if you're within an organization, any one of us obviously here who's in that's shared anything on this podcast. I'm sure there's lots of names out there, but I think just asking those right questions, figuring out what your needs are with someone is going to be that first helpful step. And then, there's all kinds of specialties, all kinds of specializations in the IO field. And you'll be able to kind of hop, skip, and jump that way by assessing needs and then figuring out who specializes in this particular area.
You can do your IO shopping right here at Work Cookie. I like that. Where are we going to go next week?
So we're going to talk about this new buzzword or buzz phrase, I guess, future readiness. What does that even mean? What does it mean to be future ready? And how can leaders and organizations really leverage what we understand already through research to move into that next future?
There you go. Well, our time is up. I hope everyone had a great time today. Thank you very much again for your contributions as well. We hope you enjoy listening to the podcasts as they come out. And to everyone listening, because we're almost to the long weekend, have a great long weekend. Forget about the world and spend some time with your family. That's probably the best advice I can give you. So thank you very much, everyone. And Dr. Emi, if you'd like to count us out of here, we'll see everyone back in 1 week's time.
Absolutely. 3, 2, and 1.